Good afternoon and welcome to Saturday Sesh. My name is Trey Reckling. I'm the founder and director of Academy of Cannabis Science, and we're so glad to have you on today. Saturday Sesh is something we do monthly on the first Saturday, most always the first Saturday of the month, even on a holiday weekend like this. And it's an opportunity for us to have cannabis professionals, industry professionals, in to talk about what they're passionate about and why likewise they think you may should share their passion. So we're really overjoyed today to have Chuck Olivier in with us. Chuck is a longtime friend, an associate from the Cannabis Alliance. Also, Chuck has been a longtime advocate and volunteer with the Seattle Hempfest program for years and years, and really just represented the spirit of the weed, and I gotta love you for that. Chuck
Thank
also
you.
is the founder and owner of Dime Bag Scales, which he's going to tell us a lot about. Because Chuck, I've got a lot to learn about scales and measures, and I appreciate you coming on and being my teacher today.
Well,
But
you're welcome.
if you could give me a little bit better, do yourself a little better justice with the intro. Tell us some more about Chuck.
So my name's Chuck Olivier, and I'm the proud owner of the Dime Bag Scale Company. Dime Bag Scale is a commercial scale company, just like any other scale company in America, except I'm 100% focused on cannabis. I've been a advocate my whole life, my whole adult life, and in 2012, we passed I-502 in Washington, creating the world's first free regulated cannabis market. I saw an opportunity to make a living with a plant, which is something I couldn't do before, and I jumped in. And I would also add, I am also an Academy graduate. I'm a certified medical cannabis consultant in Washington, although I have not worked as one yet. We still have a lot to fix with medical. But today we're going to talk about some recent weights and measures law changes as it affects cannabis. And the bigger issue is the 10-year issue. This is all good stuff. Now that we're 10 years in, mainstream government, mainstream science, mainstream professionals are starting to catch up with us and participate with us. 10 years ago, when I started Dime Bag Scale, nobody could talk about cannabis at their mainstream workplace. And now it's sexy and everybody wants to jump in and everybody wants to throw their profession at cannabis. And along the way, weights and measures they haven't paid much attention until the last 2 years, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
And I think about it, some of the first math cannabis users might learn is how many grams are an ounce, how many
Oh, don't,
ounces,
yeah.
right? How many ounces are in a pound? And some of us even might have bought our first weed bags with some kind of little trinket of a scale that was handheld.
Oh,
That, if you
yeah. I
all
still have
recall,
mine. I still
yeah,
have mine.
I meant to pull up an image, but a little trinket of a scale that was probably no way accurate. Um,
No.
but in an
Meh,
industry,
meh. Somewhat
eh,
accurate.
okay, all
Somewhat
right,
accurate.
yeah, it's better than the look see measure, right?
If I divide or
so,
choose.
but before we get there, before we get into talking about professional measures, how'd you get into this, Chuck?
Oh, well, so on the personal side, I've been a pot law reform activist for most of my adult life. Seattle Hempfest, 22 years. And after 15 Seattle Hempfests, we, quote, legalized weed in Washington. So we had a minor victory there. On the professional side, I've done a lot of different things over the years. Years ago, I was working as a mainstream scale technician for a scale company. I was the industrial guy, so I did a lot of pallet scales in warehouses, bench scales in food factories, grocery stores, that kind of thing. I loved that job. I really liked working as a scale technician, and I became the supervisor of the shop, and I just loved that job. Didn't pay enough, didn't pay near enough. Uh, and no scale technician in this country they're still not paid well enough. So I left and went and did other things, and come around, we pass I-502. And if you look at our law, it says standardized scales. And that's not a scale term. If you Google up standardized scales, you see musical notes. And so I did a little bit of digging into what they were doing, and the light went off. And $3,000 on a credit card later, the Dime Bag Scale Company was formed.
Very good, very good. That, well, and it's interesting because you were the first person
Mhm.
that kind of the light bulb went off for me, and I'm like, well, this is an industry built around grams, right? Like in the
Well,
the discussion of grams, and grams are dollars now. And so not only are
especially when it comes
grams,
to concentrates.
yeah, yeah, not only are grams dollars, grams are compliance. And so want to get into that too. I know, let me show some slides that I've got pulled up if you'd like to help introduce
I
folks a
want,
little bit
you bet. I
to.
want to answer one question first. So just so that
Sure.
we're all on the same page, there's 453 grams in a pound, not 448. And an ounce is 28 and a half grams, not 28 grams. And one of the great, and you can go ahead and throw the slide, is one of
Okay.
the great things about our industry, the cultivators, my customers, they go from grams to pounds in the same sentence, and they can calculate that in their head. So they bought it for this much a pound, they're going to sell it for this much a gram. And I use a calculator and a converter every time. I'm amazed by how they can go back and forth. And that's, as we'll talk about this later, our legacy measurement, right? The 28 gram ounce. That's going to all come into play when it talks about scale tolerance, but we'll get there in a minute.
Great. And I want to confirm, can you see
I can
the
see the
slide?
slides.
All right. So help us understand what we're looking at, Chuck.
So I stole one from another. This is my standard intro slide. So the top pick is, this pick was like 2 months ago. That's me at Washington Bud Company. And that was a candid pick, not posed. But I like what it's got. It's got my test weights in there. It's got a bench scale. It's got my tolerance sheet on it, and it shows me documenting everything. And this is weights and measures in cannabis happening. The picture on the where I look nice is from too many years ago. That was from a marijuana venture article, but that they did early on. But I think it's my headshot. On the bottom are my affiliated logos. So you see Dimebag Scale, and that's a Washington State scale company. Next to that, you see the State of Washington Weights and Measures logo. And the two on the right are going to be more about what we discussed today. So the National Conference on Weights and Measures, and ASTM. And let me say a moment and talk about the National Conference on Weights and Measures. So this is a group of the chief weights and measures enforcement officers from all 50 states and the Navajo Nation and Puerto Rico, and there's 54 of them, chief enforcement officers. And they run this thing like the Congress. So that's your Senate. And then on the other side of the aisle are all of the rest of the weights and measures inspectors, officials, government lab employees, but everyone's a government employee, right? There are no private entities involved there yet. I'll get there in a minute. So every year they get together and they debate new weights and measures law, and it's constantly changing. The big thing going on right now, besides cannabis, is electric vehicle charging stations, right? We're blowing those out all over the country, and we're going to start charging people electricity like we're charging them for gas. Still figuring that out. So National Conference on Weights and Measures is the semi-governmental agency that writes the weights and measures laws.
Okay.
And we'll get to how they're published in a minute. The next logo over is ASTM, and that's a standards organization. And the hardness of concrete, how thick the walls of a nuclear reactor need to be, what is the abrasion resistance of denim, right? They've embraced cannabis. There's a cannabis committee, and I sit on that committee, and we've written a lot of standards that will affect our industry as it gets more mainstream. So go ahead and pull up the second slide, or the middle slide. Can you center it, or are they all centered for everybody?
I can only see my screen. Is it centered for you?
So on my screen, I see my top slide, and then my middle slide is
Oh,
cut
here.
off
Hold
halfway.
on. Let's try that again then. This should be a better look.
There we go.
Okay.
So these are the handbooks. And so what happens is the National Conference on Weights and Measures writes the handbook. And that's all government officials. Private industry is allowed to be a part of the National Conference on Weights and Measures. I'm a member and I sit on a few committees. We can advise, we can testify at open hearings, we can offer knowledge, but we cannot vote. I sit on a cannabis task group, so I've been watching all this happen in live time. The NCWM writes the handbooks. NIST, our nation's measurement laboratory, publishes the handbooks to give them federal authority. NIST is where the atomic clock is and where all
Okay.
of our standards are kept and how they measure things, how long is a yard, how the nanometers involved in measuring electricity, right? All this happens there. So the handbooks are written by the weights and measures officials. They're published by our nation's measurement laboratory to give them the force of federal law. Now, these handbooks then have to be promulgated or adopted by the various states. And that's a patchwork. So in Washington, we're still working off the 2016 handbooks. Some states adopt the new version of the handbook straight away, copy and paste. Some states do not. And they want to go through that stuff and see how it affects their state. And then they want to have an act of their legislature to pass that weights and measures law. So it's a patchwork. But here are the basic handbooks that govern weights and measures and packaging and commodity law in America. Handbook 44 is all about scales and scale design and tolerance. Handbook 130 is the law and the packaging regulations, which we're about to discuss. And then off on the right is Handbook 133, which affects us as well. And so that's net weight. So potatoes, they don't weigh each bag of potato chips, really. Right, there's a net weight statement, and they. I'll explain that in a minute. But when there's a difference between a net weight package and a random weight package, and so if you go to the grocery store and you go to the deli and you get a half a pound of cheese, and it costs this much a pound, that's a direct sale random weight package. You choose your weight, right? It's weighed out in front of you, and there's a lot of regulations required. In cannabis, we get a package that says net weight 1 gram, right? You never saw it weighed. There's no scale in the store. So you're taking that packager's word for it that that package contains a gram or an eighth or an ounce or whatever. And there's a whole handbook on how that is audited. And that's what Handbook 133 is.
Gotcha.
Next slide. Everybody, any questions so far? No. So here's what you came for. So in 2023, cannabis arrived in Handbook 130. So that was January of this year. Weights and measures officials in all states now have authority over water activity, moisture loss in net weight packages, potency, packaging, and labeling. Now, once that gets adopted, you have 1 year to comply. So January 2023, that is published. January 2024, weights and measures officials can now go out and start testing potency. They're not going to. That's not why we're here today. However, the annual meeting just ended, and in 2024, compliance by 2025, big things are happening. We have a definition for cannabis, and we have a method for sale. So let me start. And I put a sentence in bold there so I don't have to repeat it after everything I say. But everything I'm about to say is marijuana and hemp, food, non-food, human, and animal.
Okay.
So cannabis has a definition, and it's a great definition. And Ruderalis was an interesting ad at the last minute from a very informed weights and measures official in California, right? So cannabis, I'm not going to read the definition to you. There it is, but it says cannabis is the plant, and it's either 0.3 or less total delta 9, which is hemp, or 0.03 or more delta 9, which is marijuana. And we all know this definition.
And some of our students who are new might not grasp
Oh,
that yet. So just want to point that out because some people are just joining us, right? And some people who will be watching
oh,
this after
gotcha.
the fact will be naive to the fact. So we're talking about the same plan, and at one point arbitrarily, and because THC has always been both the boogeyman and the rock star of cannabis, the intoxicating content are one of the most well-known and effective intoxicants. They said, well, if it's above 0.3, we're going to call it marijuana, and using that Mexican word on purpose because it was intended to scare. Um, and then if it's lower than that, we're going to consider it hemp, right? Both by scientific definition, otherwise, it's the same plant, but we're going to bifurcate it. We're going to say, hey, we're going to, that zero point 0.3 line of THC makes one different than the other. And that's why we have some states with hemp laws. And well, that's why we have a legally after the Hemp Act, right?
Oh,
Well, it won't get into that, but that's why some states, that's why the point three is so important, and we'll get into that a little bit. But I just want to back up just for a second and point that out. Thanks, Chuck.
of course. And this is not a fact. This was told to me, but this was from a reputable source. They came up with the 0.3% because that was the lowest level that they could test for at that time.
Ah, interesting.
And so, in case if you guys haven't grasped this, it is exactly the same plant. It's just grown differently. So, plants grown for bud are going to look and be a certain way. Plants grown for hemp, bast and hurd and fiber are going to look a completely different way. Same plant. But as far as the federal government is concerned, we have hemp, we have marijuana. So now cannabis is defined. It is a specific consumer commodity like milk or orange juice or motor oil or meat or all the yarn, right? It is a specific consumer commodity with a definition in our nation's weights and measures law. The big one is the method of sale. So there are all kinds of rules related to method of sale, and you can see this at your grocery store: ice glazed chicken, frozen fish, bread, flour. There's all kinds of different rules about different methods of sale and how things are supposed to be stored for many different commodities, right? Animal bedding, et cetera, et cetera. Cannabis, I'll repeat it one more time: hemp and marijuana, food and non-food, human and animal. When your unprocessed cannabis is kept, held, offered, or exposed for sale, sold, bartered, or exchanged, or ownership transfers, all unprocessed flower in the United States supply chain will have to be held at 0.55 to 0.65 water activity until it is packaged. That is huge.
And that's a pretty, if I can ask, that's a pretty, seems from the number, a pretty narrow window, a very precise window
It's a very precise window.
Could cause problems for some people, right?
Yes. And so earlier, one of those logos, ASTM, this is where that standard came from. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of good reasons to store cannabis properly. There's a lot of reasons for consumer protection and equity in the marketplace that we want it stored at a steady moisture level. But this is one the big bombshell is that starting in 2025, in states that adopt the handbook's copy and paste, they're going to have to store all this stuff in a humidity controlled environment.
Whether it's stored by the gallon or by
it's just flour, just flour. This is just flour.
I know, but whether you have a bin that's 13 gallons in the bin or a half an ounce, right?
Yep, all of it. Yeah. Anything that so in a deli style state, right? Apothecary style. I like apothecary style, dispensary style. That cookie jar is going to have a humidity pack in it,
right?
Because that bulk cannabis is being kept, held, offered, or exposed for sale.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I mean, I know. I think a lot of people would understand why you don't want too much water because it helps contribute to mold and other nasty things in your plant. But and sometimes those of us who've gone and purchased recreational cannabis know that sometimes it could be so dry that you don't need a grinder at all. You just kind of do like this and powder it in your fingers, and to some consumers, at least like me, that's way too dry and it's not pleasant either in taste or otherwise. So so it's interesting that it's to me that it's such a narrow window of 0.55 to 0.65.
You're correct, and so most Washington here in Washington, the stuff's dry as a bone coming out of the bag. And I'm not sure how stores in Nevada are, but I'm going to illustrate a reason why we need these kinds of rules. So when you walk into a pot store in Washington, it reeks of raw weed,
Hmm.
right? It just smells strong, right? It shouldn't, right? That's all sealed packages, right? There's no open cannabis in the store, but there's this overwhelming terpy smell of weed, right? So if those smells are getting out, air is getting in, moisture is leaving, we need to control that. And the as far as consumer protection, so the drier cannabis is when it's sent to the lab, the more potent it's going to test out at because it's potency by weight, right? So you send it in bone dry. Now the labs, they don't care about how dry it is. They only care about how wet it is,
Hmm.
right? Because if it's too wet, it can mold. So you can send it in dry as a bone, get a high potency test, bring it back to your facility, expose it to moisture, boost that biomass up. Now you have more mass to sell at a lower potency than what is on the label.
And it's not unlike potency equation aside, not unlike what happens at grocery stores in the produce section, right?
Mm-hmm,
Because
mm-hmm.
yes, they're keeping your by misting your vegetables, they're keeping them moist. Not only are they keeping the parsley moist, they're selling you water at parsley prices, right?
I'm going to look at that. There's probably a method of sale for that. I'm going to look at that. I'm going to take
But
I'll get back to
like
you on that.
well, like my dad told me years ago, he said, "Yeah, that's a nice thing. They're keeping it fresh, but they're also selling you water
Mm-hmm.
at times beyond the cost of
Right.
water, you know."
Right. Yes. No, it's true.
So
Yeah. No.
right.
So is everyone with me so far? So
Yeah,
cannabis has a
I think so.
definition. Yeah, yeah. There's so much going. Don't worry, you have me. Just you have my contact info. You just get a hold of me on this stuff. And anybody on the call, please email me. I'll get back to you. So we cannabis is defined as a specific consumer commodity now. That's not going away, right? So mainstream has caught up with us. We now have a method of sale for all flower in the supply chain. Next slide. This is the other big one that affects everybody. So there are in the uniform packaging and labeling regulation, right, as written, that's why things look like they do. That's why there's a principal display panel that identifies a product and has a weight at the bottom. And that's why there's a side panel where you can put things like nutrition information and a back panel. And anybody in the cannabis industry who's designed their own custom packaging is very familiar with Handbook 130's requirements because certain percentages of your front label need to show certain things. So now, in states that adopt this immediately, all cannabis products, and the same sentence I was repeating before,
Hmm.
on the principal display panel, it'll have to say contains cannabis. Cannabis must be capitalized and italicized. And the statement that it contains more or less 0.3 THC. And then on the back or side panel is a declaration of servings and serving size. And I think that's great. I think that is so. I'm excited about this for consumer protection and consumer information. So on the bottom half of the slide, I kind of, in my artful manner, show you what that looks like. So there's your marijuana front panel, there's your hemp front panel, and this side panel. This is from New York. New York's regulatory, they're in their rulemaking right now, and they put up this really great image, and I took it. So props to New York. There it is, right? And so for their dose, they came out with a 1/4 gram bowl pack. I think that is a dose that all potheads can easily identify with and picture in their brain. So wonderful for this example. But so now you know how much THC and how much CBD is in that bowl you're smoking. There you go. Right. So I don't know about size, but it's like you got a 1/4 gram bowl and a 1/2 gram bowl sitting right there, right? Exactly. The little bowl, the big bowl.
So obviously, bowl is not for people in weights and measures. It's probably not near as precise as they would like it to be, but it is, like you said, it's common language,
It's
and it
common
helps
language. It's
bridge that gap, that knowledge gap.
right. But exactly. So I think this is brilliant. We'll see if anybody actually puts that out there. But the bottom half of this slide displays what will be required on the label.
Great.
And before we leave this, another issue that we should talk about in the various states, right? So we haven't talked about how this labeling rule is going to collide with the packaging and labeling rules in the various states because they're all a little bit different. And so, some history in Washington, in our first round of laws and rules, our bags had to say contains marijuana right on the front of them, right? And there was some other verbiage there that didn't make sense. And as an industry, we pushed back and we said, you went into a marijuana store to buy a package of marijuana that you held in your hand, and it's blue dream. And so we were able to get that line stricken out of our packaging. And now it's coming back.
Interesting. Well, and the folks from Poison Control wanted to put a Mr. Yuck sticker on all cannabis products for a while
Yeah,
to
exactly.
discourage kids from consuming the cannabis. And people were like, look, my medicine is not yuck. That's not fair. And I remember there were very vocal outrage about the idea that people were calling what some consider beloved and sacred medicine yuck or poison. They're like, my medicine is not poison. It can be, it can be not for kids, but doesn't mean it's poison. We know it won't kill you, but
The so speaking of the symbol, I didn't cover that today. We'll cover that in the next one. So the rulemaking for the next year has already started, and we're going to see that universal symbol come into the to this labeling law,
gotcha.
and it'll be the international symbol for intoxicating cannabinoids, something like that. The ASTM passed it,
Hmm.
and it's a basically a warning sign with a pot leaf in it,
Okay.
and that will become the United States universal symbol for cannabis. And it will also collide with the patchwork of universal symbols throughout the various states.
So yeah, lots of moving pieces, and
Yes,
we haven't even talked about the we'll get to
I
about
think
the
that's all the information. I think that's the big.
that all right.
That's all the slides. Yeah.
Well, and if y'all are following the news this week, I know this is a lot of moving parts, but in the news this week also, you probably caught or may have heard there was a leaked memo that was sent from Health and Human Services to the DEA recommending that cannabis be removed as a Schedule 1 drug, which means no medical benefit, high likelihood of misuse and even addiction and danger to consumers sort of thing, to a level 3, which would some people argue, myself included, that it should just be deschedulized completely and treated like alcohol or something. But Schedule 3 would allow people to make the 280E tax exemptions that are not currently available, that make everybody's cannabis more expensive at point of sale, that cut profits out of the retail side of the equation. Retail and production processing sides of the equation, and so that hasn't happened. But the Biden administration was pushing them to examine whether or not it should be Schedule 1, and if they follow that, it'll at least be movement in a positive direction, right? So it would be
Mm,
scheduled like codeine, like ketamine, like some others, which I would still argue it doesn't belong with prescription drugs, but um, at least it would, and it could reduce some people's criminal penalties too. But it's still not enough, in my opinion. But
I agree, and I think the only positive thing that might come out of it is 280E,
right.
and we'll see if that in banking, but we'll see if that really changes anything. So if are you guys? Is everyone here familiar with 280E? Okay, so we're going to chat about that because it's a huge part of why our industry is the way it is and how things are.
Do you want to give that a
Um,
shot, Chuck?
yes, I will, and so I'm gonna. There's the case. Let's see, it's Edmondson. I'm going to put it in the chat. It's a fascinating case. Let me get back to the meeting. Yeah, here's the
So,
case.
so typically, just to kind of set this up while you're pulling that up,
There it is.
businesses can do tax write-offs for certain business expenses, and for a
Yes.
long time, cannabis was disallowed because it was a Schedule One substance, from taking any of those tax exemptions, which makes the expense of d- doing cannabis business a lot more expensive for the retailer, which of course all those, or for licensees, pass those costs along to us consumers.
So exactly that. So this is a great case out of Minnesota. A guy got busted for selling drugs and went to jail. And the IRS came after him anyway for taxes because they will do that regardless of how you generate your income in the United States. The IRS is going to come for taxes. And he says, well, I need to be able to deduct the necessary and ordinary business expenses. I had to buy the weed. I had to buy bags. I had to travel to get it. And so if you're going to come after me for taxes, I deserve to take these deductions. And he won. And he was able to take his deductions from the taxes they tried to pull from his criminal enterprise. And so Congress enacted Section 280E of the tax code, which says you cannot deduct necessary and ordinary business expenses. We'll get there in a minute. You can't deduct necessary and ordinary business expenses if you sell a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substance. So the business, you have cost of goods sold, which is how much it costs you to buy what you sell or how much to produce what you sell. And then you have all the rest of the expenses like utilities and phone and postage and insurance and your website. Cannabis businesses can only deduct cost of goods sold. They cannot deduct staff. Well, so you play with this, right? The cultivator can write off the cost of the growers who grow the stuff, but they can't write off the cost of the front office staff who run the business. Retailers can only write off what they bring in, the product they bring in. They can't deduct anything else. So cannabis operators are taxed, I think it was 45% by the end
I
of the day, some
it's
ridiculous
a
number
much
like
higher
that.
number, yeah.
Yeah. And so in theory, what this change in law will do is it'll drop cannabis to Schedule 3, which will allow these businesses to now deduct their necessary and ordinary business expenses, which could be huge.
Hmm.
We'll see if it frees up conventional financing and loans and banking, but I don't think so because you're still dealing in a Schedule 3 substance, which requires a prescription, which you can't prescribe because the FDA hasn't approved it except for the one drug. And what a mess.
And Cory Booker and some others continue to push for the banking bill, but we'll see.
We'll see.
There have been a lot of promises, as is there are always annual promises about federal legalization, and I don't think those are anywhere on the near horizon. But could I back up a minute, Chuck? What all gets weighed? I
Mm-hmm.
think as consumer, you might think, well, the weed that I buy gets weighed, and maybe minus the weight of the package itself. But there's a lot more that gets weighed that must be weighed in an operation
Absolutely.
grow to sale. Can
Absolutely.
you point out some of that stuff that the scales are actually being used for?
So everywhere. So on the cultivation side, everything's done by weight, right? So, except they're weighing nutrients, they're weighing samples of harvested flower for the lab, right? There's all kind, ingredient mixing. On the packaging and distribution side, everything is done by weight, right? Many, many packages of flowers and joints and concentrates and edibles. In the cannabis business, all of those weights have to be documented in the state traceability system. And so if your weights are not accurate, you'll have a mismatch. Or if you switch into units, right, you grow it in pounds, but package it in grams, and there's a conversion there. Your state traceability audit will not mesh up with reality, and that could be a problem traceability wise. You don't want a traceability rate violation at all.
Yeah, because not only you're out of compliance, you're either screwing yourself or the consumer, whether
Right.
you're over or under your weight. And I
Yep.
know early on we were having discussions in the state with the Department of Agriculture and others about, well, what is a harvest weight? Is it the
Mm-hmm.
wet weight? Is it the weight when you cut it down, or is it the weight when it gets processed? Because those of you who have grown weed or cannabis know that yes, those buds are nice and heavy, as is the plant when you first cut it down, and then you hang it to dry, and you lose a significant percentage of that weight, which is just water, which you can't have before it goes into a jar or a package, or else it becomes moldy and unusable and nasty. So, so yeah, water is always, or it's often part of this equation.
Very much. And some states require individual plant weights. Right. So in Washington, they chop the plant, throw it in a bin, and weigh the gross bulkage. Other states, California, Oklahoma, just adopted this. You got to weigh each individual plant as you harvest it. Scan the tag, weigh the plant. Varies state by state.
And part of that is we know there's a whole lot of cannabis that's getting shipped out of legal states into
Yeah,
states where it's not legal.
yeah. I mean,
And
Oklahoma's the leader now.
is that right? And
Yeah,
so yeah, so the illicit market is thriving. It's always thrived, right? The market has
yeah.
always been there. Like people are like, I hope you market your cannabis. Well, we've survived before without any marketing for dozens of years, and it is its own best advocate, right? People, if you have good weed, it's well known kind of thing. But um, anyway, I got off on a tangent. Get us back on track,
That'll happen.
Chuck, if you will.
You asked. That's what's going on with weight at a licensed
Okay.
cannabis facility, right? So there's traceability weights all along the way. There's the net weight packages that they're putting out there to the consumers. And then all of that weight gets audited within the state traceability system, which is unique for cannabis operators versus a shampoo factory.
And do you have horror stories, I imagine, of, because not everybody
Yeah.
comes to somebody like you and says, "Hey, test my scales," I imagine. And I 8 years in or so for legal cannabis here, well, depending on how you count it, some people might have started their business with the same scale, I imagine, that they're using today, but don't
Uh,
check that every year. Am I right? And
no, you're right, man.
what kind of heartache could I be in for if I'm one of those people?
So my favorite story with that was way back in the beginning. There was an article in the Seattle Times. It was like, one of the hey, here's a new weed operation, and they had a postal scale that they were using to weigh enforcement of the weights and measures side in Washington was absent for the first 5 years. And I have compassion for them, right? So your typically your weights and measures program is run by the Department of Agriculture in your state. Departments of agriculture are very reliant on federal funding. And a lot of the weights and measures officials didn't want to touch cannabis because they didn't want to mess with the feds. And in Washington, if you remember, just a few years before we passed I-502, we tried to redo the state medical system. And then the federal government said they were going to prosecute any state employee involved in doing the registry. So Washington was doubly scared, right? They didn't want their weights and measures officials, probably, I don't know, but I would assume they didn't want to risk put those employees at risk. So there was not a lot of enforcement in the beginning. I have seen some nightmares, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And there's still plenty of operators out there using smoke shop scales to weigh their stuff because there's actually very little enforcement.
And when you say smoke shop scales, you're like the $15 scales I could buy
Yeah.
on Amazon or from a
Yep.
head shop. Yeah.
That's correct. That's correct. Plenty of the I walk into businesses and they'll have one compliance scale with my seal on it, and you go over there in the packaging line and there's 8 head shop scales going on.
Right.
It is what it is.
Gotcha. And then in the labs, we're talking about a lot more precise weighing, because
Oh yeah.
when we're weighing point 0.3, and even finer than that, because of our minor cannabinoids sometimes certainly show up at much lower weights.
Mm-hmm.
It's critically important that our labs have this right. But I imagine labs being, well, I assume labs being of a more scientific mind,
Yes.
would likely more understand the problem and the need for this, right?
Yes, but labs are not subject to the legal for trade NTEP rules
Hmm.
that cannabis packagers are. Scientific instruments are highly, very, very accurate, but they're used for process control. So, for instance, at a cannabis farm, the scales that they use to make retail packages have to be legal for trade and calibrated and sealed in place. The scale that they use to weigh nutrients needs to be accurate, but it does not need to be legal for trade because you're not buying or selling over it. So most labs don't have any NTEP scales because they're the testing of them to make them legal for trade would be just over the top. I mean, in a lab, we're talking a glass draft shield in a room with no vents, and the a laboratory environment much different than a cannabis packaging floor for sure.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Yeah,
Well, I want to pause too because I've been dominating your time and I want to see if anybody on the call has questions before we move forward.
everybody kind of glassy eyed. This just drink it all in and review the slides and just know that all that stuff's going to have to be stored in a moisture controlled environment, and it's going to be interesting to watch the labeling laws happen.
Yeah, let's come back. Let's see if anybody does have questions because I don't and I'm going to use a brand name, but Bovida is an example of one company who has jumped in with both feet and been very generous to folks in the cannabis space. But Bovida sells humidity packs, and anybody who's a cigar smoker knows a humidity pack, or like the purpose of a humidor. It keeps it at a steady, keeps your tobacco at a steady humidity to keep it from drying out, becoming too moist, etc. But you could also, if you don't have a humidor, you could buy these little packs and it'll say 54% on it or 58%, or it'll have different ratings. And that's the humidity that it's attempting to get your product at. If it's in a jar, for instance. So if I, as a home grower, put my weed in a quart jar, I can put a Bovida pack in there at whatever percent and drop it in, and it'll help me to do that work. Now,
Yep.
when I first put it in, I'm still going to be burping my jars every day to get the excessive humidity out. But these packs, and it's smart because all they're selling us is saline, salt water, in a permeable um, pouch, but it's permeable at a certain percentage to allow for this humidity exchange. So it's brilliant, and they're effective, and they're everywhere now. Now I know there are other ways to get there, but is that how you think most folks are going to be compliant? And what's the discussion around the cost per serving? Because if I'm only selling you a gram, that's very different than selling you an ounce. I mean, I would have to
Well,
use a bigger pack, but it's going to increase my expense as a producer or
no,
as a
no, no,
processor, right?
not in the retail package. Only unprocessed flour.
Oh, okay.
Once
I
the flour
misunderstood.
goes into a package, it becomes now those rules. That's another set of rules I didn't cover for today. That'll be next year.
Hmm.
There will be a 3% moisture allowance either way on a net weight
Okay,
package check, but that hasn't been placed into rule yet. That's still being
gotcha.
discussed. Um, the so Bovida is the leader in the space. Their stuff is great. They can be in contact with your cigars or your cannabis or your Stradivarius violin. Doesn't matter. Doesn't harm it. Keeps
Right.
the humidity. Yeah, they sell Bovida for musical instruments. Integra is the name of their largest competitor. I don't have a lot of experience with Integra packs. As a consumer, I choose Bovida packs because they work great. So either they're going to need to put humidity packs or some other way, right? So if you could use fan leaves for moisture, I suppose, and if you had a proper gauge measuring instrument on top of your storage tub, as long as it's stored to 5.5 by 6.5, doesn't matter how you get there. That'd be
Right.
one way to go about it. Or you buy a bunch of humidity packs and keep those in your bulk storage. That's coming.
And I know some
That's
people
hemp
also,
and weed. That's everybody.
right, right. And hemp, and of course, we're talking about tonnage. We're not just
Tonnage.
talking about pounds, because when you have a hemp farm, you have acreage, not just square feet to grow in,
Mhm.
you know. And when we're talking about, at least in this state, we're talking about some states just talk about plants, and we're talking about square footage
Right.
of grow space. But then on the hemp scale, we're talking acres. And
Acres.
so, and that's been one of the challenges of getting the hemp industry back up is we've allowed farming, but we don't have the infrastructure to then turn that product into a consumable good, whether it's textiles, animal feed, um, hemp
Toilet paper.
bricks, paper, bricks, hempcrete, you name it. And so it's coming, but that's been a heavy lift for the industry to have the peace because they're like, hey, I've produced all this hemp, and sadly, a lot of farmers
Rotting
didn't.
in the drying sheds. There's nowhere to
Yeah, a
sell
lot
it.
of farmers didn't even have a place
Yeah.
to adequately uh, dry out their product,
Right.
right?
Because everyone's buying our CBD industry in this country. Everybody thinks it's grown from American hemp. It's not. It's CBD oil purchased by the kilo from overseas. Right. There's good actors,
Mhm.
and I can recommend some. Right. So when my family members and friends of family members, especially the elders, will secretly come to me and say, "Hey, what should I do?" Or I got this, and I'll vet that out. And there's very good actors in the space. But the stuff you see in convenience stores, the stuff you see at the smoke shop in prohibition states, that's imported straight CBD oil from overseas, much cheaper than growing it.
And if you're not familiar and you haven't been through our cannabis professional class or another class that we might have introduced the concept to you, is back in the day, the Philippines was our number one
Yeah,
supplier of hemp. And
that's correct.
Kentucky was growing a lot,
Yeah.
as were some of Virginia and some other states, but
Wisconsin was another big one.
Wisconsin, and
Yeah.
then but the Philippines were our number one producer of imported hemp. And then what do you think happened in World War II that cut off that supply? The Japanese
I
invaded
know, I know.
the
Yeah.
Philippines, and then all of a sudden we didn't have that supply anymore. We were busy using it for ships riggings and things that were important to the war effort, uniforms, etc. And so all of a sudden hemp went from um, or cannabis went from being talked about in the worst terms to the government created a new type of propaganda film, and it's hemp for victory. Leah already put in there, or Leah
Yeah.
already put in there. Thank you. And so I encourage you to check out Hemp for Victory, because it was in the 1940s when our government was teaching people, well, maybe this plant does have a good purpose, and we're going to teach our farmers how to grow it again. And so they were actually they backed up and did an about face, and then once the war was over, they're like, well, we're done with that. We don't want you growing hemp anymore. And so it was a short-lived reintroduction to a crop, but real interesting on the American history side.
You know what I learned at the Academy of Cannabis Science is that in World War II, they were given draft waivers to farmers who would stay home and grow hemp for victory.
Thanks, I forgot that, Chuck. Thanks.
Yep. Yep. It's like how quickly things changed, right?
Yeah, right.
And
So
yeah, yeah. The Emperor Wears No Clothes is a great book to read, and anybody, I recommend taking a weekend, prepping yourself properly, and watching all of those propaganda films. Uh, Reefer Madness, marijuana, this and that, the devil. They're great. Right.
yeah, interesting. Reefer Madness was not really popular. It was a scare film made by a religious organization called
Yeah.
Tell Your Children, and it wasn't until Keith Stroop from Normal cut the copy down some. He made significant edits because it was a long, boring movie, and repackaged it as Reefer Madness and toured college campuses and presented it in a whole new light. And then it helped it kind of gain its popularity, and a musical was created, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the old stuff is worth looking into, not just the old
It's
commercials. The all the prohibitionist thinking was effective.
for professionals in this space. If you're going to make your living in the cannabis industry, you definitely owe it to the predecessors, to the legacy people, to know what they came through and know what they went through and know what they were faced against, to know what your parents were taught, the propaganda that they were exposed to. And you got to understand the past to really appreciate where we are. I think that, certainly in Washington, people are over legal weed. It's just like, it's fine. There's weed stores, you go to the weeds, but there's so much work left to do. And there's been so much damage left in the wake of cannabis prohibition. It's on us to somehow switch that energy to the positive. Yeah, definitely learn the history
And
if
and
you have. It's fascinating, and you read stuff, testimony in Congress when they passed the Marijuana Tax Act. You read testimony in Congress, right? You can go read it. It
when the AMA stood up and said,
yeah,
"Look, whatever you call marijuana, we call cannabis, and we've got over 100 prescription
yeah,
medicines on the
yeah,
on the shelves that we're
yes,
actively using. So please don't make this illegal."
yep.
Um, but yeah, Chuck, that's a good point, and the fight's not over. And
No,
also, as we frequently remind people, today there are 50,000, over 50,000 cannabis prisoners, really political prisoners, in our American jails for non-violent cannabis offenses. And that's why we work with an organization called Last Prisoner Project. and help supply scholarships to folks who are getting out of jail for those offenses to help them find real legit jobs in the same space that they were burned for. So please proselytize, not just about the potential benefits of cannabis to people on opiates and much harder stuff,
Someone's
but
getting arrested right now. Somewhere in
yeah,
this country, someone's getting handcuffs put on them for pot. They're getting hauled off to jail, and it's ridiculous.
even in our state, in Washington State,
Probably so. Yeah, some.
if you grow a cannabis plant without being a patient here, it's a felony on par
That's true.
with third degree rape, with assault of a police officer. It's uh, judicially considered the same level of offense. So
So in
a
Nevada,
lot of
you
work
have
to do.
home grow. We don't. And Nevada just
Unfortunately,
got your stuff pushed out, right? Like you can grow more now, and like didn't your purchase go up like 2 ounces at a time now? Isn't
well,
that right?
they did make some adjustments this year. Unfortunately, you can only grow if you live a certain mileage away from a retail
That's right.
store.
That's right.
So it's
That's right.
not it's nice if you live in a super rural area, but if
Yeah.
you live near a shop, you still have the lack of rights that we do here. So
Gotcha. Gotcha.
although big shout out to Nevada and Las Vegas who are doing this differently, who are really pushing the line with 24-hour sales, with drive-throughs, with lounges coming online, and some really interesting things. And I applaud your state and hope that you all will do it responsibly, because states like ours, states like Georgia, Washington, I mean Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, etc., um, need to be shown it can be done without the house burning down,
I
right?
want to bring it all home to you. So Vegas consumption lounges. I'm engaged in an interesting LinkedIn conversation right now. Individual dab hit. How do we dose that?
Um, It's never been well, and there are some products where
Right?
they're trying to.
I
I don't know. Have you seen the products
by
where
volume, by weight. What's that?
they make little pellets? It's like a little dab pellet,
I've
and
never seen that.
they're
Cool.
weighed out, and you drop that little pellet. So it is a precision, it is a measurement, and I imagine we'll see that with with a variety of. We have pre rolls that do that on the smoking side, and we have but with like a vape cartridge, how do you determine what is a hit or what is one
Well, and none of
draw,
that's
right?
compliant, by the way. We're selling, but the packages are labeled by weight, but sold by volume, and the
Interesting.
viscosity of the different fluids is different. So you're not getting it's. So this milligram thing would take care of that. So instead of selling a 1 gram vape cart, you're selling a this many milligrams vape cart, and that's more legit. Yeah, the whole way we do vape carts is not compliant right
Interesting. So
now.
Chuck, hey, thanks for coming on, because I needed a lesson in this, and there's so much I think that um, you're one of the people representing a part of the industry that often gets underreported, as you know, and
Yeah, yeah,
overlooked, because
absolutely.
without the growers, without nutrient specialists, without lighting specialists, all these people who don't always get their picture on the front of these cannabis magazines, this industry doesn't work. And so
Well,
thanks for doing the work that you're doing, because you're part of our network that keeps that fiber all our tapestry kind of woven. So we appreciate you.
I'm literally living the dream, so it's cool.
And thank you all for all being on today. I will vow to you I've got this one and another Saturday sesh to post up. Those will be up just within a few days on our YouTube channel. So if you're not following us on YouTube, we've got dozens of hours of free additional education. So we encourage you to check out that. We've been doing this for a number of years, and are proud to have brought in special guests like Chuck from all over the world. So check out our YouTube channel, follow that, and then this will be posted up there shortly. We will be back again in October with a guest that we have not yet announced, but I'm very excited about. So that's coming out soon. And then Tuesday night, if you're enrolled in class, please join us for Tuesday night student lounge with Dr. Juliana Giles, who will be on to talk about cannabis as medicine. Thank you so much. We appreciate y'all's time, and have a great rest of your Labor Day weekend. Thank you, Chuck. We appreciate you.